Welcome to this morning's program, Coffee with the Curator, Surfacing the Secrets of River Bridge. My name is Stacy and I handle adult education here at the museum. And it's my honor to introduce this morning's curator, Ayla Amon, a curator of political and cultural history here at the North Carolina Museum of History. Ayla, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Stacy. Good morning, everyone. As Stacy mentioned, my name is Ayla Amon. I'm the Curator of Political and Cultural History here at the museum. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about an upcoming exhibition at the museum called River Bridge, Sunken Secrets. And we're going to talk about how the archaeological objects in the exhibit can give us more information about the economic, social, and political histories of this site. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I would love to engage with you. So feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat box, and we will address them after the presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hoping you can all see that. So let's begin with a brief overview of the history of the River Bridge site itself. River Bridge is located on the Pasquotank River, just north of Elizabeth City. As you can see, I've marked on this modern map. It flows south down into the Albemarle Sound, which in turn provides gateways to the Atlantic Ocean, which was historically much more accessible from the Albemarle Sound than it is currently. And it also flows north to the Great Dismal Swamp, which was called a wild region of swampy backwaters. And it was also originally much larger than its current boundaries. Now, before the site became known as River Bridge, the Pasquotank River and its tributaries were in use for hundreds, if not thousands of years by the indigenous peoples who inhabited the region. So you can see on this 1585 map, some of the major villages that were present from indigenous people upon the arrival of colonial settlers. Now, the orientation of this map is a little bit strange, but the Pasquotank River is the one that runs between the green and orange lands, as you can see here. Indigenous peoples navigated these shallow and sometimes very twisting or tangled waterways in dugout canoes, like the Chickasaw example from the 1500s you can see on the right. They used them for travel, trade, pleasure, and as a means of harvesting fish and other water creatures for food. So as you can see in the painting on the left by colonialist John White, they fished in multiple different ways, with nets from their canoes, using spears, and they set up cage-like weirs or fish traps in the water, and you can see an example of a weir on the far left of that painting. We also know there were indigenous villages in the area of River Bridge, home to Algonquin-speaking peoples. The villages usually contained roughly 12 to 18 communal homes, which would house 100 to 200 people. So you're looking right now at the village of Pomyak, which was built by one of the Pasquotank tribes. The name of the town essentially means an area that provides a good landing place for boats, and it's located on the Pamlico Sound. So there are communal longhouses in this image. There's a religious house, which is the one with the pointed roof on the upper right. You can also see a central gathering fire, and there are depictions of people with bows, axes, and even a domestic dog. This might be one of the earliest depictions of a domestic dog in the Western Atlantic world. Now, we don't know exactly when a bridge was built spanning the Pasquotank River, but records suggest it was as early as 1736. And North Carolina deeds and laws indicate that there were inspection stations at the site as early as the 1750s, where they had to inspect, quote, pork, beef, rice, indigo, tar, pitch, turpentine, staves, headings, shingles, and lumber. So this kind of gives us an indication of some of the goods that were transiting the river, both for import and export. And in addition, merchants maintained warehouses on both sides of the river by this time. There was also a post office and a church at the site. You can see that church is circled in red on this map. Now we know the site was actually called River Bridge by the 1760s, when George Washington mentioned it in his survey notebook. So Washington and other Virginia settlers had formed the Great Dismal Swamp Company in 1763 with the goal of, quote, draining, improving, and saving the land. unquote. Washington surveyed the Dismal Swamp alongside 60 enslaved laborers before he headed south, where he noted in his diary entry that the Pasquotank River, and as you can see on your screen, he said, quote, decreases in width gradually to the bridge called River Bridge on up said river, where it's about 30 yards over and affords water for New England vessels to come up. So this last part means that the vessels from other major ports, not only in the Western Atlantic world, but from Europe and Western Africa, could enter to trade goods in the Pasquotank, including engaging in the transatlantic slave trade. Now from 1805, when a canal was built through the Dismal Swamp connecting the site to Virginia ports, trade greatly increased at River Bridge, meaning the circulation of people and ideas did too. And during this time, River Bridge was one of the major commercial ports that imported goods from around the globe to North Carolinians. And it funneled North Carolina made goods out to the rest of the world, including timber, rice, and the main naval stores, turpentine, tar, and pitch, that gave up the Tar Heel state its nickname. So on the left is a wharf scene showing some laborers unloading hogshead of tobacco at a wharf. And on the right is a bill of outward clearance that notes a shipment of shingles, staves, and tar heading for the Barbados Ore Market from Elizabeth City, just south of River Bridge. In the 1850s, a new route was established called the Chesapeake Canal that bypassed River Bridge completely, severely diminishing trade, as you can see on the left in this Civil War map of the plan of the Battle of South Mills from 1862. So you can see here is River Bridge on this curve of the Pasquotank, and the New Cut Canal goes right past it, and it was easier to transit up the New Cut Canal. Although we do have shipwreck evidence that the area around Elizabeth City was still sailed around and after the time of the Civil War by both military vessels and passenger steamboats, suggesting that trade goods could still have made it to the River Bridge site. So on the top left is a map showing about 60 shipwrecks in the Pasquotank River near Elizabeth City. And in the bottom left is one of those wrecks. It was a former schooner turned into a military vessel called the Black Warrior. Now, unfortunately for River Bridge, another new canal, the railroad, and modern highways eventually pulled trade from the site completely, which is reflected in the objects themselves, very few of which date to this post-Civil War period. But this did not happen before thousands of objects found their way into the riverbed to be excavated beginning in 2011 by divers Philip Madre and Eddie Covington. We know that there was a wide range of goods imported to River Bridge, and they were stored at warehouses and inspection stations near the wharf. So I'm going to show you some of those goods now. They include things such as household and commercial wares, like decorative and functional ceramics, including redware vessels, stoneware storage jars, and tablewares, from teapots to hand-painted and transfer print teacups and saucers. Here are a couple more examples of that. These span the date range from River Bridge's activity, and ceramics were by far the most found objects excavated at the site itself. They also found glassware ranging from elegant pressed and hand-blown tumblers and wine glasses to pharmaceutical bottles and containers for drinks like port wine. They found tools like this broadaxe or a railroad trunk lock. They found recreational objects. Here you can see a thimble and pins, you can see pipe heads, you can see marbles, and you can see porcelain doll's legs. They also found a large number of shoes, and you can see here an advertisement for shoes and clothing that was placed in the Elizabeth City Star in 1833. These are one of the most fascinating for me because they're made of leather. So they're often the kind of thing you don't find very frequently at archaeological sites. They also found personal objects, such as this fascinating foot marker for a grave. And they found building materials like shingles and boards and staves that would have been used for housing, for docks, for boats, and for all different kinds of building projects. And they found foodstuffs. So you can see here bones from pigs, cows, fish, and turtles, as well as peach and plum pits. So this kind of hints at some of the food that is being consumed in the area. There is even a preserved beaver pelt, which is number 4 in the case on your screen. Oops. So as you may have noticed, many of the images I've shown you are of objects that are in pieces, that are very small, or objects where it's difficult to understand what they are. So why are these so historically important? Well, the over 10,000 objects found at River Bridge, about 250 of which will be in the exhibition itself, are not just broken objects. They speak to trade networks, some ancient and global. They speak to manufacturing technologies, to economics and social mobility, to the latest fashions, and depending on what they were used for, they speak to foodways and health practices as well. And most importantly, they tell us about the people who have been left out of or marginalized in the historical records. So they speak to Indigenous peoples, especially pre-colonial settlement. They speak to enslaved and free people of color. They speak to immigrants and women. So I'd like to take you kind of up close and personal with 3 objects from the exhibit that explore these different histories and give us a richer, fuller picture of the world that existed at River Bridge. So here's our first artifact. You can see by the ruler that this is a very small piece of pottery. And at first, this small piece of broken pottery really doesn't look like very much. But we know that it dates from the Woodland period, which was from circa 800 to 1600. We also know that this sherd would have been part of a larger pottery container, perhaps one that held a food or a drink or medicine. And when we look closely, this sherd is marked with these really small indentations that appear in a regular pattern throughout the surface. So the entire container would have likely looked something like this, and it would have been completely covered with those small indentations, which were made through net impressing. This means that when the clay was still wet, the potter pressed a fishing net into the clay to make the pattern before the clay was fired. And this small pottery sherd speaks to the Indigenous people who inhabited the lands around River Bridge for hundreds of years before colonial settlers arrived. It shows us how they stored food, how they hunted, how they decorated their ceramics, and how deeply connected to the water their lives were for travel, trade, communication, and hunting or fishing. Now, the few Indigenous objects found at River Bridge were utilitarian, decorative, and ceremonial. They were made of natural materials like clay, stone, bone, and shell, and they speak to a way of life very deeply connected to the water. This is also one of the few artistic expressions we have from these groups directly, rather than the interpretations made by colonial settlers, such as the paintings I showed you earlier. This pottery is a way for their voices and stories to reach us from many hundreds of years ago. And in addition to creating paintings, colonial settlers brought various European produced trade goods to coastal Carolina, such as the beads you can see on your screen, but they also permanently altered the landscape and the lives of Indigenous peoples. Europeans carried new diseases, forcibly removed people from their lands, and enslaved and killed many. Despite this, Indigenous peoples remained resilient, and tribes today still connect to the traditional ways of the water. However, this does mean that there are not many items excavated from River Bridge that can be definitively connected to Indigenous peoples after colonial arrival. So our second artifact, these small rusty pieces, are even more difficult to read and understand. But these strips of iron, which are hoops that would have gone around a barrel, tell the story of industry in North Carolina, of the tar, turpentine, and tobacco that made it rich. But they also tell the story of the thousands of enslaved workers and free people of color who lived, labored, and worshiped here, and how they changed the landscape of North Carolina forever. So North Carolina's coastal communities, such as that along the Pasquotank River, were diverse. And by the 1790 census, people of color, both enslaved and free, made up 31% of Pasquotank County's inhabitants. Many in these communities were, quote, raised to the sea. They were working as river and sea boatmen, fishermen, pilots, and shipbuilders. Others dug inland canals through the swamps and harvested turpentine, tar, and lumber in the forests, as you can see on the left of the screen. The census additionally records free Black farmhands, carpenters, servants, blacksmiths, washerwomen, domestics, and seamstresses. Now, these barrel hoops represent the Black men, enslaved and free, who worked together ferrying people and goods at wharves up and down the coast. This work provided income, spaces for autonomy, a way to purchase and pursue freedom, and access to information, including abolitionist sentiments and news of rebellions from both sides of the Atlantic and down into the Caribbean. Captain Moses Grandy, who was enslaved in North Carolina, purchased his freedom using wages from ferrying goods. He noted in his autobiography that he, quote, collected lumber in Albemarle Sound for the merchants, that he had never lost a single thing of property, and he also mentions delivering a cargo at Elizabeth City for Mr. Truitt. It's very possible that Mr. Grandy sailed past and visited the River Bridge site itself. North Carolina's waterways also provided avenues to freedom for enslaved people. Some self-liberated on the Maritime Underground Railroad, an informal network of waterways, vessels, and supporters that helped some enslaved people in Eastern North Carolina make their way to freedom using seaports. It was well known enough to appear in runaway ads in local newspapers, such as the one on the left of your screen. One of the most well-known people to use this Maritime Underground Railroad was Harriet Jacobs, who's on the right, who was born into slavery in Edenton, North Carolina, and who escaped by traveling the swamps and other waterways. She speaks in her autobiography about the mosquitoes and the thick, heavy, stagnant air that she suffered through. Another, William Gould, who is pictured in the middle at a GAR reunion for Civil War veterans in Massachusetts, partnered with 7 other enslaved men, and on the night of September 21st, 1862, they escaped by rowing a small boat 28 nautical miles down the Cape Fear River. A naval ship picked them up off the coast, and Gould served in the Navy for the duration of the Civil War. Others gained freedom by following inland waterways, forming isolated, self-governing maroon communities in places like the Great Dismal Swamp. They often traded and interacted with indigenous peoples, and they worked alongside enslaved people in the lumber and naval stores industries. One such man was Osman, who was a legendary maroon in the Great Dismal Swamp, who was known as, quote, the king of the swamp, the protector of escaped slaves. The maritime and lumber trades were fundamentally shaped by enslaved and free people of color, and while they were marginalized in the historical records, the objects they left behind clearly show their presence in these colonial and early American spaces. So our third objects, these 2 tiny fragments, traveled over 8,000 miles to reach River Bridge, and they speak to both domestic and global economies of the time. These pieces are part of a saucer that was made for the porcelain export market out of Guangzhou, China, in the late 18th to mid-19th century. The city was part of the ancient worldwide trade network stretching back to the Silk Road that saw luxury items such as porcelain, silk, and spices move from China into Europe and then the Atlantic world. An analysis of maker's marks and distinctive designs and patterns on River Bridge artifacts confirms that many originate from far outside of North Carolina. They came from locations as far away as China, as we just saw, from Germany, the Netherlands, England, and the Caribbean. They also came from other US states, including Maryland, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York. So you can see on your screen some of the routes that objects traveled on this map, both over land and over sea. All this global transport means that wharves, the docks where goods were brought for trade, become very important spaces. And not just for commercial wares. Wharves were gathering places that also brought together people and ideas from around the globe, and they helped shape everything from politics to fashion trends. And it is fashion that helps us explore another interesting aspect of these really small sherds. Chinese export porcelain, made for the European and later American markets from the 16th to the 19th centuries, was mainly decorative. Although much like fine china today, it was often used by upper and elite classes at things like dinner parties to impress their guests. And you can see an example of that in the armorial set, which is on the right of your screen. Now, the most recognizable form is the iconic Ming Dynasty blue and white porcelain, like the colors on the sherds, and the vase on the left. Although there were also reds, greens, yellows, and blacks that were common, as in the plate in the center. Export porcelain came in the form of vases, dishes, tea wares, ewers, and other household wares, along with animal and bird figurines, ink stands, and candle stands. Now, to tell you how popular this export porcelain was, between 1600 and 1750, European nations transported more than 100 million pieces of the porcelain to European markets, some of which was then transported to America. But this porcelain was very expensive, and it was displayed and used as a sign of social standing and wealth. After 1700, however, a growing middle class demanded status symbols inspired by the lifestyles of the elite and wealthy. The result was a fad known as chinoiserie. Anything even vaguely, quote, oriental in style would sell, and anything that looked like porcelain was increasingly referred to as China. So if you have China in your house, that's the reference to the old Chinese export porcelain market. In response to this demand, a mimicry industry pops up called willowware in England. An example of pearl willowware is on the left of your screen. The famous Delftware in Holland, an example is on the right, and even Talavera-ware in Mexico. Both actual Chinese porcelain, as well as these imitation forms, were found at River Bridge, suggesting importation for various classes of consumer who lived in the area. So we've spoken a little bit how these really small objects can tell very big stories. And I want to end by talking about how these objects were actually discovered. So unlike many archaeological objects, those found at River Bridge were excavated from the bottom of the Pasquotank River. Divers, who you can see on the right, wearing suits like the one on the left, carefully explored the riverbed, unearthing over 10,000 objects so far, some smaller than a centimeter, to help tell the story of the River Bridge site. This process is called underwater archaeology. Now, underwater archaeology is the systematic documentation and recovery of information from submerged artifacts and underwater sites. Initially associated with historic shipwreck sites, as you can see in the image on the right, it is increasingly clear that the methods and uses of underwater archaeology are equally applicable to a wide variety of resources, including submerged habitation sites and historic landings and anchorages like River Bridge. Now, underwater archaeology also includes the interpretation of site and artifact data in order to generate new information about past human experiences. But this process is not without its dangers. You have cold, murky water filled with fallen trees and snagged fishing line, as well as wildlife encounters that make the process difficult, as do currents. They can displace and disturb sites, making it difficult to return day to day to an area and continue work. And of course, you have weather, including floods and thunderstorms posing a threat. The divers at the River Bridge site, Philip Madre and Eddie Covington, kept daily logs of their dives at River Bridge and what they found. And they detail water with visibility that is nearly zero and filtering through a layer of decaying organic matter, silt, mud, and clay that's sometimes more than 10 feet deep in order to find objects. So these are two examples of their log that they reported, as well as their site map showing time, place, and the temperature. So they would record things, for example, quote, "We were on site at 9 a.m. We have finished grid C4 and have started on D4. We've recovered an almost whole case bottle, air temperature 85, water temperature 60. They also note continuing work in RBG2, which is another grid site. And they've discovered, quote, a tobacco pipe, more brass pins, 2 glass beads, lots of nails, more of the feather edge platter, and some more of the white salt glazed mug with the crown mark GR on it, circa 1770, unquote. Overall, these divers collected an unmatched assemblage of artifacts. No other site has produced as many complete or nearly complete objects from the colonial and federal periods as River Bridge. That said, we hope you will come to see River Bridge Sunken Secrets at the museum, which will be on display from April 16th to September 2nd, 2022. We will also be hosting a hands-on history day for people to learn more about underwater archaeology on May 7th at the museum. And with that, I'm more than happy to take some of your questions.
Thanks, Ayla. We have quite a few questions for you, so I'm just going to start from the top. Belle asks, did the State Office of Archaeology oversee the excavations, and why was this particular site chosen for excavation?
Yes, the State Office of Archaeology not only oversaw the site, but they had to issue the permit so that the divers could do excavation at the site. They chose this site in part because of historical research that had been done before choosing the site. So we knew how important some of these early rivers were. And then when you're looking at colonial settlements and archaeology that had been done on land, then you start looking inward into waterways to see if you can match up some of those terrestrial land settlements with waterway settlements. So there was a lot of historical information putting a very important site in the river there. And they found old bridge pilings, and it kind of made a great match for an archaeological project.
Paul says, and you spoke to this a little bit already, but could you talk more about who conducted these excavations and why? What prompted the recovery of these materials from this location?
So there were two main divers, Philip Madre and Eddie Covington, who actually did the physical diving with the Office of State Archaeology overseeing it. And I think what became very clear when they started doing this archaeological excavation was that there was a lot of material down in this part of the water. And you can think about it in many ways of people would throw broken merchandise into the water. Sometimes probably crates full of material got knocked into the water, and it just creates this very rich environment and kind of a time capsule in a lot of ways. As things go down, the river covers them up, and then archaeologists can go in and figure all this out. So just the location creates a space where there is a lot of material and allows us to really do a lot of historical digging into the site because it's stratified by age of the material as well. So it's just a really rich environment to do that kind of work.
The next question is, how were the metal fragments attributed to being brought from Jamaica? Do you have any idea?
We don't know 100% sure that they were brought from Jamaica. We know that they were attached to a barrel as barrel staves around the barrel. And one of the most common ways that barrels were used in import and export at this time was for tobacco. And one of the biggest markets for tobacco was down to Jamaica, back and forth. Molasses, rum, and tobacco is what are going back and forth. So we're doing a little bit of historic interpretation to suggest that they are from Jamaica, but it's very possible that they could have been.
Cliff asks, when was the contact period on this site, if it could be determined?
Do you mean Indigenous contact period?
He doesn't specify. Yes, he does. He does mean Indigenous.
We know that there were contact in the 1580s for the first time with peoples in this site and in this region. There was no actual site for Indigenous village that has yet been found at River Bridge itself, but there are others in the region. We know they were using these waterways, however, to get back and forth between sites that did exist in the region. But the 1580s is when there were first colonial contact.
That does it for all of our questions. Thank you so much, Ayla.
Absolutely. And again, River Bridge opens on April 16th. We would love all of you to come visit. If you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to speak to you further.
Thanks, guys. Have a wonderful morning.
Have a great day, everyone.